Alright guys, in this lecture I want to actually use what we've learned so far to create a very useful mixin that's going to import a font from the Google Fonts directory where we can just pass in the name of the font we want, and then the mixin is going to handle the rest for us. So let's go ahead and add that mixin to our mixins partial right here. So I'm going to go ahead and create a mixin called Google Font, and it's going to take in the font we actually want. And just to make sure that the font is actually in the correct format for a URL request that we're going to need, we're going to go ahead and use one of the built-in functions that Sass provides for us, and that is called unquote. So we're going to unquote the string that we get to make sure it's in the correct format to use in our HTTP request URL. And now we can go ahead and just import the correct URL, which in this case is the Google Web Fonts API URL right here. You probably know this from using it in CSS as well. And then we're going to have to pass in the family here, which is going to be our font. But to use our variable in this context, meaning that we want to use it as part of a property name, we have to use interpolation, which just means we have to somehow separate this variable from the rest of the string to make sure the preprocessor knows that this is actually a variable of which it should fill in the value. So we're going to do that by typing a hash sign, and then inside curly braces we can define our variable. And now using this interpolation syntax, the preprocessor knows that this $font is actually a variable and it's going to fill in the correct value for us. Now I want to mention that you can only use this interpolation syntax in the context of imports when you're using CSS imports. So you're not allowed to import SCSS files based on some variable name. So in those cases where you want to actually import a Sass or SCSS file, you cannot use this interpolation in the variable to decide which file to import. So that's just a restriction in Sass that you should be aware of. But now this mixin is ready to go and we can use it in our actual SCSS code. So let's save this partial and then we're going to go to our main SCSS file. And now I'm going to go ahead and include this mixin and import two fonts that I want to use for this sample project. And the first one is called Allegria Sans, which I'm going to use for the paragraphs. And then I'm going to import another one, which is called Titilium Web. And I'm going to use that for the headlines. So let's hit save. And now we haven't used these yet, but we have already imported them and we can look at that in the main CSS file. So you can now see that we have these two import statements and we have both these fonts that we want to use. Now the only thing left to do is to actually use them. And to do that, we're going to have to change our fonts in our variables partial. So for the text font, I want to use this Allegria Sans, and for the headlines I'm going to use the Titilium Web. Now we can go ahead and save this as well, and now we're going to have to save our main SCSS file again to actually invoke the preprocessor. So once we do that, you can see that we have our main CSS file generated again, and we can now look at the changes, and we now actually also use these fonts in our code. And also note that the order is nice, so we have our imports before we actually use the fonts, which is not necessary, but it does make our SCSS file more readable if we do want to look at it like we do now. So it's a good idea to actually keep in mind the order in which you use your imports and includes. So in this case, these two won't create any actual CSS code. So these two are the first ones that are actually going to create CSS code, which you can see here is just going to import our URLs. And this way you have this order which you would also use if you wrote CSS code. Now just notice I have a typo in here, so I have to quickly go back to the main SCSS file and add another I here. Hit save again, and that's going to update this and it's now correct. So let's actually take a look at what our web page now looks like. Alright, so you can see that we have much more beautiful typography than before, and this is the Titilium font and this is this Allegria Sans. So of course you can play around and look for some fonts in the Google Fonts directory that you like, and then just use this mixin that you created to just try out different fonts and then look at the actual result on the web page until you find one or two fonts that you really like. So I encourage you to go ahead and do that, and then I will see you in the next lecture.